はい、それでは時間になりましたので、第1セッションを開始いたします。本セッションでは、安全保障の宇宙利用を取り巻く環境の変化について議論を行います。第1セッションでは、まず3名の研究者の皆様から20分ずつ発表をいただきます。その後、討論者からのコメントと質問に対して、各発表者にお答えをいただく予定になっております。第3セッションの総合討議において、時間が許せば、聴講者の皆様からのご質問に回答したいと考えております。ご質問は、Zoom の Q&A 機能を通じて随時受け付けております。ご質問の相手先を明記した上で、質問を送信していただければ幸いです。それではまず最初の発表者は、アメリカのハドソン研究所防衛構想技術センター長のブライアン・クラーク先生にお願いをしております。クラーク先生はですね、米海軍潜水艦の乗組員であり、海軍を退役された後、戦略予算評価センターのシニアフェローを経て、2019年から現職に就かれております。ブライアン・クラーク先生のですね、ご発表テーマは、センシングとセンスメイキングをめぐる競争での勝利です。それでは、クラーク先生、ご発表をお願いいたします。
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion today. My brief is going to focus on the ability of forces to address the threat and challenge posed by adversary space systems, particularly when it comes to sensing. This is an area of focus in the US and allied militaries. And I'll talk about why that's important. I'll also talk about some of the techniques and tools being used to succeed in the sensing and sense-making competition, and some of the challenges for delivering the capability necessary to support sensing and sense-making. The reason why sensing and sense-making is becoming more important is because we're now encountering a world where the US military in particular is no longer dominant in all environments. It's facing peer competitors. It's facing proliferation of weapons that are enabling even adversaries that don't have peer-level capabilities to now threaten US forces and allied forces. In places like the Middle East, we see groups like the Houthis able to challenge US dominance in the region. We can see in Ukraine how Russia and Ukraine have both advanced their militaries dramatically thanks to proliferation. So there's no longer any theaters that are really permissive and easy for US forces to operate in. So we're having to think about alternative ways to gain an advantage. One of the other things that constrains the ability to gain that advantage is rising O&S costs, or operations and sustainment costs. The cost to maintain and crew a military is rising very quickly. And that means that you can't simply grow your military or make it more capable to regain dominance. You have to think about creative ways to gain dominance, aside from just growing your military. The other thing we're finding is that because we have capable adversaries and proliferation in every theater, the threats are becoming very specialized in each theater. So allies have to think about no longer fielding a one-size-fits-all force, but instead fielding specialized forces that are better suited to address the challenges of a particular region. So the force that succeeds in the Middle East against the Houthis will probably be different than the force that would succeed in the North Atlantic against the Russian submarine threat, because both are very capable, but they're very different. Similarly, with China, it requires a different set of capabilities to address the threat China poses to Taiwan. And because these threats are all advancing, we no longer can take our one military that's built around a multi-mission force and use it everywhere and have it be universally successful. So going away from that one-size-fits-all force demands the ability to specialize in particular regions, and part of that is specializing for the sensing and sense-making competition. So that we need to start thinking about tailoring deterrence to the adversary, tailoring the deterrent effects against that adversary's particular capabilities and the region and geography in which they operate. When you think about China as the peer competitor that everybody focuses on now, particularly the US-Japan alliance, China depends quite substantially on its sensing and sense-making capabilities. If you look at its system warfare concept, which the right side of this slide depicts, it consists of multiple systems that work together to allow it to succeed militarily. Because China's command and control structure is very hierarchical and requires centralized control in a lot of ways. The key parts of this system of systems are the reconnaissance intelligence system and the firepower strike system. What the Chinese leadership would like to do is be able to find targets with the reconnaissance intelligence system and attack them at long range with precision using the firepower strike system, and minimize the amount of deployed forces they have to use to conduct individual force-on-force engagements. One, Chinese leaders are not confident in the ability of their deployed forces to succeed in disaggregated or distributed combat. And they're also concerned about the ability of those forces to coordinate with each other. So they're not confident in their individual commanders. They're not confident in their ability to coordinate jointly or across theaters and regions. And this is something Xi has talked about when he talks about the 5 incapables. So the firepower strike system and reconnaissance intelligence system are key to Chinese feeling confident in their ability to succeed. And then the greatest leverage points within those are the space recon intelligence system. So space and near space systems are the centerpiece and provide the bulk of Chinese sensing and decision-making support. So a key for the allies will be to degrade the ability of that space reconnaissance intelligence system to provide that kind of information. The focus of the efforts that we take to attack that reconnaissance intelligence system are going to be what we call cross-domain effects. When you think about electronic warfare and cyber, what's happening right now is countries like China that have robust command and control structures and redundant communications are firewalling their cyber capabilities behind independent and closed systems. So to insert cyber effects or cyber tools, you have to use our radio frequency aperture. So we're having to transition from a operator on the internet being able to inject a cyber effect to now having to use an electronic warfare system to inject that cyber effect. We're also finding that we sometimes need to use a cyber tool to support an electronic warfare attack so we can see if the electronic warfare attack was successful. So these cross-domain operations, so RF-enabled cyber, cyber-enabled electronic warfare, are now becoming the key mission areas for non-kinetic effects. So when we're going after the space-based reconnaissance intelligence system of the Chinese, you have to think about doing that primarily through these cross-domain operations, which means I now have to think about not just building a cyber tool, but also building the electronic warfare system that delivers it, the platform that carries the electronic warfare system in proximity to the target, and then the command and control that allows me to manage that operation. So what used to be a hacker with a malware software code now is turned into a kill chain that we have to create and then field, which makes the supply chain for non-kinetic capabilities much more challenging. So in terms of the how we generate these non-kinetic effects, so I'll go briefly through some elements of this. The specifics would be obviously much more detailed and classified, but in general, this is how you would go about going to try to defeat the space-based reconnaissance intelligence system. It starts with focusing on first reducing your ability to be accurately detected. So we have to shift to passive sensing and bistatic sensing to a much greater degree. You can see in the picture here, use of uncrewed systems is increasing because they allow you to send sensors closer to the enemy, which means a passive sensor will be more effective. They also allow you to put multiple sensors out into the environment so you can get multiple lines of bearing using passive sensors to detect a target. So to get target quality information from a passive sensor, we often have to use uncrewed systems because it's the only way to get a sufficient number of sensors at different angles and also a way to get close enough to the target to detect it. Then once we've isolated or reduced our own emissions, we then focus on how do I create false emissions. So the starting point for Chinese sensor networks is their signals intelligence satellites. So this shows a picture of a few of them. They're geostationary, they're focused at the equator, they have pretty wide coverage, and that's the first place they go for sensing information because it covers a very wide area. So using electronic decoys, we can create a lot of false targets here. And by using passive sensing, we can reduce the number of real targets. So it confuses the targeting picture. With that confusion, Chinese operators will then turn to imaging sensors to attempt to understand the picture better. So synthetic aperture radar, electro-optical sensors, infrared sensors are all part of the Chinese reconnaissance intelligence network. These systems would attempt to navigate or to negotiate the which false targets are false and which targets are real by getting imaging from them. There's also ways to jam and decoy these sensors as well. SAR jammers exist. SAR decoys are available even commercially. Electro-optical decoys are more difficult, but can be done, especially on the ground. And infrared decoys are also fielded today. An example of what we're seeing in terms of decoys is what's happening in Ukraine right now. So if you look at the lower right-hand side there, that's a radar system decoy that the Ukrainians built that does accurately represent the system enough to be targeted and attacked by Russian missile strikes. On the left-hand side, you see a HIMARS decoy. Again, these are not perfect decoys, so if you get close to it, you can see that it's not real, but from the distance, from a distant UAV with a relatively unsophisticated camera, or from a space-based system especially, they'll look real enough, and they'll attract more attention, and they'll require more diagnosis and processing. And then you also have other decoys like electronic decoys, such as the bright cloud, but that'll simulate the radar return from a real system. So there's radar return or radar decoys, there's passive electro-optical and infrared decoys, and there's signals intelligence decoys that generate false signals that will be detected by the enemy. And you put all that together in a campaign, essentially, by, if you look on this chart on the right-hand side, it starts with in this case, unmanned surface vessels, simulating destroyer emissions by generating false signals that would look like a radar. That confuses or creates targets for the signals intelligence satellite. The operators then have to go investigate those using imaging satellites. So then you go to number 2, and the synthetic aperture radar attempts to locate where the real ships are using radar emissions. Synthetic aperture radar decoys and jammers would defeat the ability of those sensors to be effective. And then the enemy would have to turn to deploying sensors out to try to investigate. So they would send out aircraft and ships to try to identify what these targets are. And the communications could be jammed there. And one of the keys to defeating the reconnaissance intelligence network is going after these connections that allow the sensor network to coordinate or correlate targets between the SAR satellite, the signals intelligence satellite, and the deployed forces that are attempting to geolocate or to identify particular targets. So defeating that sensor fusion and that sensor correlation is a key element of the campaign. And then when the enemy decides to engage, maybe, and just start shooting at targets in an attempt to reveal which ones are real, decoys we found in the wargaming we've done with the JMSDF have been very effective at seducing away missile attacks on ships and preventing those ships from being detected by using ordnance to attempt to classify them. So what these counter sensor operations would do is defeat the ability to understand exactly what the picture looks like. they would be combined with an effort at what we call counter-sense making. So the key to that would be having a force that's more interoperable, a force that's able to compose itself in more different combinations of units or force packages. So instead of on the top slide or the top part of the slide here, we're showing how if your force is small and focused on a relatively small number of very capable multi-mission platforms, it tends to have a limited number of ways that it can be configured, which means that for the enemy, it's easier to figure out what the target picture is because they can assume that if you only have 3 carriers in your entire military and you show them 10 carriers on the picture, they can pretty quickly figure out that most of those are false targets and they can ignore them. But if instead you have a much more numerous military, like on the bottom part of this slide, with a lot more options for how it can be organized and deployed, then it gives you more options for deception. So you can send out your decoys, you can use your jammers, and the enemy has a harder time figuring out what the ground truth is. One of the elements that we try to take advantage of in this sensing and sense-making competition against Chinese space-based ISR is the ability of space-based ISR to provide direct feedback to the red side without going through the global information environment. So if you look on this chart, the red controller would be the China controller. The green controller is the allied controller. So it's our forces and making decisions. What we're doing is generating actions, and the green actions that go into the world state, they get then detected by red, and that feedback loop goes directly to red because our jamming and our signals intelligence decoys are being detected directly by red. So although there might be commercial systems out there, they aren't generally sharing that information publicly. So the red side is not being embarrassed on the world stage by our actions, and instead we're sending signals directly to them to show that their sensing and sense-making network is not reliable. And by making that system seem unreliable, we're going to dissuade them, hopefully, from aggression that depends on that system. So if you depend on the reconnaissance intelligence system to provide targets for your reconnaissance or for your firepower strike system, then anything that interferes with your reconnaissance intelligence system's accuracy will make you less competent in your ability to execute that attack, especially if it's an attack that has to happen over a short period of time, such as during an invasion of Taiwan. But to generate these kinds of effects, we have to generate or create what we call magazine of surprise, because what will happen is if you have a very small number of deception techniques and tools that you can use, then you can quickly run through them, or you end up reusing the same ones, and then the enemy figures out what you're doing, and they lose the effect of undermining his confidence. Because if the enemy receives or sees a deception technique they've seen before and they quickly diagnose it, then they feel more confident. It actually has the opposite effect than our intended effect, which is to try to deter or dissuade them. So we need a deep magazine of different effects to be able to support this kind of counter-sensing and sense-making campaign. And what is happening inside the US DoD is a major effort to try to bring more industry providers and more companies into this ecosystem, just like we've seen on the kinetic side with companies like Anduril and Shield AI coming in and offering a large variety of new kinetic systems. The DoD is trying to generate the same kind of enthusiasm on the non-kinetic side with startup companies coming in to develop new non-kinetic techniques. And by doing that, you can see on this chart what we're trying to depict is you want to start with a lot of options available to you for non-kinetic effects. And then as you go through the competition with the adversary, you'll start to use those effects. And cyber and electronic warfare tools often get consumed. When you use them, the enemy figures out a countermeasure, and then the tool is no longer useful. So it is completely expended once it's employed once. So you have to have a deep magazine to allow you to have a superior number of tools available to you as the clash or the competition proceeds. That will give you the advantage of always having yet another tool in your tool bag to be able to bring out and continue to undermine the confidence of the opponent in their reconnaissance intelligence system and its ability to support the firepower strike system. So we came up with at the very end of this is a six-function process for how the DoD or other militaries could develop new non-kinetic techniques. And I won't go through these in detail, but the main thing is the development of a virtual environment in which new non-kinetic techniques can be developed and demonstrated to the government, and through which the government can buy those techniques just like they would buy a kinetic system that's been demonstrated by a new startup company. This process is one that the DoD is actively pursuing in a variety of areas, and I could see it being employed in the near future to support non-kinetic technique development alongside kinetic system development. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back over, and I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, すみません、クラーク先生、どうもご発表ありがとうございました。クラーク先生の方からはですね、中国を念頭に置きまして、中国の戦場における情報収集能力、それからそうした情報収集能力に基づく状況把握能力に対していかに対応していくのかという観点からご発表をいただきました。特にですね、多様なですね、非破壊的なツールを使うことによって、いかに対応するのかということについて、具体的なご提案ということをいただきました。クラーク先生、どうもありがとうございました。続きましてはですね、米ファルコンリサーチのシニアフェローであるジョン・クライン先生からご発表いただきたいと思います。クライン先生は米海軍でのご勤務の後、ファルコンリサーチに入社されました。クライン先生はジョージ・ワシントン大学の宇宙政策研究所であるとか、米ジョージタウン大学の戦略学プログラムの方でも教鞭を取られています。ご発表のテーマは競争上の優位のための商業宇宙です。それではクライン先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
おはようございます。Thank you for the introduction, and it's indeed a great honor to speak here at the National Institute for Defense Studies and to be part of this distinguished panel. For the control, I am pushing my slides on Zoom, but I don't see them on the screen. Or are they being... My remarks today focus on commercial space being used for competitive advantage by governments, to include the United States and Japan. We've seen the emerging commercial space ecosystem is opening up new or expanding existing markets, along with playing a key role in the ever-changing global security landscape. Within the last decade, commercial space activities have expanded significantly in both scale and diversity, resulting in new capabilities and services that take advantage of off-the-shelf technologies and lower barriers for market entry. These recent developments are contributing to a burgeoning space industry driven by entrepreneurial innovation and investment, advanced technology, and decreased costs. Space technologies, particularly commercial ones, play a substantial role in the conduct of everyday commerce and international trade, and because of the growing demand, the number of satellites launched per year is growing exponentially. Satellite deployment rates have increased nearly tenfold since 2014, driven by launches of commercial satellite constellations. As you see on this figure presented, most of the satellites launched in the last few years have been commercial. Those countries with space launch capabilities, including members of the European Union, Japan, China, India, Russia, and the United States, have greater control over scheduling whose satellite is launched and when. Many Western space strategies acknowledge the importance of the private sector in achieving political and military objectives. For example, the French space defense strategy explains, quote, alongside central governments, private sector actors play a key role in the economic development of a space industry, which is now more flexible, more innovative, more connected to the other segments of the economy. The United States and China have long grasped the importance of this crucial turning point for the development of our societies. Europe and France cannot turn a blind eye to an emerging area of potential conflict, end quote. The emergence of disruptive innovation by space companies necessitates changes in the way France approaches the development of its space capabilities. Moreover, Japan's 2023 Space Security Initiative emphasizes the importance of both allies and the commercial sector. The document outlines the country's initiatives necessary for space security over the next decade and reflects those related efforts as part of Japan's Space Basic Plan, which is a cross-governmental initiative. In highlighting the need to work with other Western liberal democracies, the document notes that the purpose of Japanese space security is, quote, to promote the peace and prosperity of Japan and the safety and security of our citizens through outer space, together with our ally like-minded countries and others to maintain the stable use and free access to outer space, end quote. For many security experts, the technological innovation in the commercial sector is seen as an opportunity to achieve a competitive advantage over rivals. Governmental leaders expect that entrepreneurial interest and investment in space capabilities will lead to significant changes in civil, commercial, and national security uses and access to space. Commercial space innovation is considered critical for developing novel ways of operating and protecting national security interests extending into space, and governments often see commercial space companies as a source for achieving strategic and political objectives while spending less than they would have otherwise. Furthermore, government procurement professionals frequently seek to capitalize on commercial innovation to gain new capabilities using faster, more responsive acquisition process. As a result of innovation in the commercial marketplace, some national security space experts view commercial advancement as needing to inform not only which services can be commercialized, but also which mission areas should be the focus of space forces. As a result, policymakers need to understand which space functions should be solely government-owned and operated, and which functions are able to be integrated with or completely outsourced to commercial. Many national security analysts expect that the commercial activities will play a significant role during future competition and potential conflict in space. Strategy's function is balancing desired ends with available means, and the commercial actors play an available means to support the desired ends of policies, and as you see in this figure. This relationship results in commercial activities potentially playing a considerable role during competition, crisis, and conflict. The use of novel commercial technologies will play a key role in the strategy of space warfare. This is because the employment of commercial advanced technologies holds the promise of creating an asymmetric advantage between belligerents. In general, the employment of innovative technologies is an enduring part of both regular and irregular styles of warfare, but this is especially true during irregular forms of warfare when one competitor is less capable than the other. A less capable space power will seek any possible advantage and will try anything that might work to gain an edge during conflict. And the purpose of exploiting innovative technologies is to nullify one or more of the enemy's advantages. Therefore, the task of the disadvantaged space strategist is to alter the military balance to its benefit, which includes using novel technologies and weapons of war. This disadvantaged belligerent will likely avoid regular conventional styles of warfare in favor of irregular modes, where a technological edge can yield maximum benefit. For many space powers, the allure of finding a single dominant technological solution to achieve any warfighting advantage will be just too great not to try. For the space strategist, it is helpful to think of the technology's utility, including the application of commercial innovation, in terms of achieving strategic effect. Technology and its application are meaningless in a strategic sense apart from the effects achieved and the realization of the outcomes that positively affect a conflict at the strategic level of war. Particularly within the U.S. defense establishment, there is often a widespread belief that superior technology is always the answer without understanding what the question is. How will war's outcome be affected? Bigger, faster, and higher are seen as the ultimate criteria for technological success, but such data exists in its own world of unreality. Importantly, the strategic effect is determined by the target and not by the means of attack. Therefore, advanced technologies in themselves will not determine whether strategic effect is achieved or not, but the manner in which technologies are used and if the adversary's decision calculus is affected will do so. A good space strategy is one that yields sufficient strategic effect to achieve political ends and make positive military gains. The strategic effect, or the common currency earned through military behavior and action, is generated by the fortitude, blood, and treasure expended during conflict. There is growing interest in space actors using external third parties, whether state or non-state actors, during future crises and conflicts. Indeed, history of land warfare and naval warfare illustrate the repeated use of third-party organizations, groups, and participants when employing force to achieve political aims and strategic ends. During the conflict of land warfare, soldiers of fortune and mercenaries, or those paid to fight, deciding to do so willingly on their own behalf, or third-party auxiliaries hired out to another party by their own government, frequently played a pivotal role during military operations. In naval warfare, privateers have also played an important part, including during the early days of the United States. Soldiers of fortune, mercenaries, and privateers all relate to the concept of using proxies during war and warfare. These external third parties may be either national or extranational actors. Proxies are those organizations, groups, and participants acting on behalf of another. These third parties may intervene on behalf of a sponsor or benefactor to help influence events and achieve political aims. Within the context of irregular forms of crisis and conflict in space, commercial and quasi-commercial entities may act as surrogates for governments or other sponsoring organizations and groups. These sponsoring governments, organizations, and groups may look to commercial entities to provide emerging technology, novel capabilities for achieving political objectives and achieving strategic effect. Also, the use of commercial and quasi-commercial space actors can absolve the sponsoring party or benefactor from having to undertake its own direct action by outsourcing either benign or questionable activities to commercial third parties. Commercial space proxies would allow a sponsor to affect the outcomes during competition and conflict while being at arm's length and avoiding direct exposure to potential military escalation and adversary threats. The use of commercial proxies during space warfare can make attributing either provocative or harmful actions more difficult, thereby preventing a sponsoring actor from being held responsible for the commercial proxy's actions and avoiding the adversary's follow-on retribution. The idea of commercial and quasi-commercial actors serves as an alternate method for achieving desired political aims and military effects corresponds to the indirect approach, as addressed by British strategist B.H. Littlehart, shown in this figure. In his writings, particularly his book, Strategy, the Indirect Approach. In the book, Littlehart writes that the indirect approach incorporates the idea that strategy should adjust as the situation develops in war, along with achieving political positive results apart from direct, large force-on-force engagements. By incorporating the direct and indirect approach into competitive and wartime strategies, policymakers and military leaders can achieve greater operational success with fewer casualties. Although Littlehart never addresses the concept of commercial proxies, the use of commercial surrogates by a sponsoring government, organization, or group is certainly in line with this thinking. The use of commercial and quasi-commercial entities can help achieve political aims and military objectives while obviating the need for governments to risk the destruction of its own fighting forces. The utilization of commercial space sector's capabilities and services can help a sponsor achieve advantageous situations and decisive results, including throwing an adversary off balance and leading to one's operational advantage, as Littlehart recommends. Some examples of commercial space proxies being part of the indirect approach are using commercial and non-governmental space services to conduct information operations to shape public opinion about a competitor's actions, using commercial surrogates to conduct cyber attacks against a rival's space-enabled communication networks, and using quasi-commercial entities to conduct rendezvous and proximity operations along with non-cooperative docking to coerce an adversary. The commercial sector also supports a space strategy by enabling sponsors to purchase novel capabilities and services to create an asymmetric advantage. Asymmetric advantage is a strategic concept going back over 2,000 years and is part of the writings of Sun Tzu. Fundamentally, sponsors and commercial proxies are able to convert fiscal capital and economic power into other form of power to achieve strategic effect. This is simply buying power. While a government organization or group may not have its own internal capabilities, it can simply procure the needed novel capabilities to deter or compel a competitor, if having the requisite financial means. Even if having relatively minimal domestic technological capability, a government or organization can still achieve substantial political aims and strategic effect through the procurement of commercial capabilities and services. Sponsoring states, organizations, and groups may enter into contracts or service agreements with commercial space companies to augment the sponsor's access to and use of space. Through the procurement of commercial companies' novel capabilities and services, the sponsor does not need to spend up money up front for the research and development costs of high-end space systems, as is common with many government-led space programs, but only pay for those commercial services for a specified purpose and duration. By not needing to spend money up front on the technology research and development, cost savings are realized, and such a contractual arrangement can give middle and emerging space powers greater access to the capabilities and services that they would not have otherwise. Many of the commercial space capabilities associated may be considered dual use in nature, thereby causing ambiguity as to whether the space systems are solely benign or have military implications. By procuring commercial technologies and services, a state can lower its risk in a competitive environment by gaining additional dual-use capabilities to achieve an operational advantage over a rival. Commensurate with the fundamental precepts of asymmetric warfare and the indirect approach, using commercial capabilities during competition and conflict is part of the precept of trying anything that might work. There are several examples illustrating government, organization, and groups buying power to create potential asymmetric advantage, and these include entering into service agreements for commercial satellite communications with guaranteed availability throughout the peace-conflict continuum, purchasing commercial space launch services, whether as a primary payload or as a rideshare, procuring commercial on-orbit servicing and inspection capabilities, contracting for terrestrial-based space situational awareness services for detecting and tracking a competitor's satellites, and contracting for active debris removal capabilities for use against a rival's defunct satellite in a non-cooperative manner, and lastly, acquiring commercial on-orbit dual-use capabilities to coerce a competitor. Some governments and defense agencies, like those within the United States, are seeking to take advantage of commercial advancements by blending governmental and commercial architectures. For many government leaders, the commercial sector is seen as a way of achieving cost savings and incorporating innovative capabilities at the same time. Certainly, the commercial sector is moving rapidly in providing robust and proliferated capabilities on orbit, and so the thinking goes it would be foolish not to take advantage of existing and planned commercial space capabilities. When considering existing space architectures, some space professionals view the interleaving of governmental and commercial architectures as a method to dramatically improve deterrence and space resiliency. Deterrence efforts would be improved by distributing risk throughout a proliferated, disaggregated, and diversified capabilities that operate across various orbital regimes. Through the integration of governmental and commercial space architectures, it is possible to achieve greater diversity of capabilities and services while reducing any inherent vulnerabilities associated with using small numbers of high-value, exquisite government satellites. Countries that integrate commercial systems and capabilities into their governmental space architectures can potentially achieve an asymmetric advantage over rivals by taking advantage of commercial innovations, cycle speed, novel technological capabilities, proliferated satellites, and diverse orbital regimes, all at significant cost savings when compared to using solely government-funded efforts. As used in the paper that I'm providing in this lecture, hybrid space architectures is the intermingling of governmental and commercial capabilities and services across the space, terrestrial, and link segments. Hybrid space architecture is frequently used in the context of mixing small constellations of large, exquisite, and expensive governmental satellites with large constellations of smaller, less costly commercial satellites, with the combined architecture spanning various orbital regimes. In general, a hybrid space architecture is understood as governmental and commercial constellations working in an integrated fashion more effectively and efficiently than individual parts. Will commercial capabilities be there to support governments in times of war? This is a frequently asked question among national security analysts when looking to fully integrate commercial space sector into an overarching space strategy. This is the question on the minds of many military service members. The short answer to the previous question is yes. This question and answer are not unique to the space domain. The aerospace, automotive, shipbuilding industries have a history of providing military products and services during times of conflict. Unless there are conditions beyond their control, commercial companies will seek to honor the terms of a service level and licensing agreements because reneging on contracts would cause the company to lose market share and future revenue. In short, it's bad business not to keep your word. Yet it must be underscored that commercial companies will support states in times of conflict if the applicable arrangements are in place before the onset of war. To ensure that the commercial sector can provide the most benefit in times of conflict, it is necessary that militaries and commercial partners establish trust during peacetime. Only by establishing trusted relationships and sharing information on commercial products, services, and capabilities can a space strategy be implemented effectively and in a practical manner. To best incorporate innovative commercial space capabilities, companies and governmental organizations should thoroughly understand certain subjects before conflict occurs. These areas of understanding include the following: commercial companies and governmental licensing authorities, the applications when commercial assets are employed to support military activities, governments considering the ways and means necessary to protect commercial space assets when employed to support military operations, companies and their shareholders needing to consider the implications of commercial space assets becoming targets for kinetic or non-kinetic attack because of the services provided to governments during hostilities, for commercial remote sensing companies understanding the potential level of control that licensing nations may exert during hostilities, establishing the most effective and efficient communication structure or architecture between governments and commercial partners to enable the unimpeded flow of data information during peacetime and conflict, and ensuring commercial partners have access to all necessary data information, whether classified or not, to ensure they are able to provide the agreed upon products and services during times of war. Finally, commercial entities can operate in a non-traditional manner, which can make some policymakers uncomfortable because commercial actions may appear to be quasi-governmental or quasi-military in nature. This would be the case of private military companies providing security or military services on behalf of a government sponsor. The blending of governmental and commercial roles and capabilities may raise legal questions regarding how best to discriminate between military and non-military objects during conflict, and these questions must be discussed and debated well before the onset of hostilities. Going forward, a key takeaway is that Western leaders and policymakers must consider and have a meaningful dialogue today regarding their respective comfort level and policy implications of targeting a rival's third-party commercial capabilities. Targeting those commercial capabilities and services providing meaningful military capability to an adversary may lead to unintended conflict escalation or establish a normative behavior that is counter to U.S. and allied long-term interests. Domo arigato. I look forward to the discussion that follows.
はい、クライン先生ご発表ありがとうございました。クライン先生の方からはですね、ご承知の通り今商業衛星の数が非常に増えていて、かつその能力というものも上がっている。 ということを踏まえた上で、どのようにですね、そうした商業宇宙能力サービスといったものを軍事的な優位性につなげるために活用していくのかというお話をいただきました。特に孫子であるとかリデルハートといったですね、まさにイギリスで戦略学で博士号を取られたクライン先生ならではのですね、概念を入れていただきながら、いかにこの商業宇宙能力というものを軍事的な優位性に活用していくのかということをお話しいただきました。また最後のですね、やはり平時からですね、企業と軍の間で信頼性を築いておくことが大事であるというメッセージも非常に重要であるというふうに認識いたしました。それではですね、次には最後のご発表になりますけれども、米空軍大学のですね、中国航空宇宙研究所研究部長であるケビン・ポール・ピーター先生からですね、ご発表をお願いできればというふうに考えております。ポール・ピーター先生はですね、カリフォルニア大学のグローバル紛争協力研究所でありますとか、米海軍分析センターの方でご勤務をされた後に、つい最近、今年ですけれども、2024年今年から現職に就かれております。ポール・ピーター先生のご発表テーマは、中国の拡大する宇宙能力と対宇宙能力ということで、発表をいただきます。それでは、ポール・ピーター先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the National Institute for Defense Studies for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to talk with all of you about the thing that I find most interesting, and that's China's space program. So before I begin, I have to state that as a Department of Defense employee, none of the views or opinions that I'm expressing here necessarily represent the views or opinions of the U.S. Defense Department or the U.S. government. So with that out of the way, I thought I'd spend just at least a couple minutes here talking about the growth and the expanse of China's space industry over the past 30 years or so. If you look back in the 1990s, early 2000s, China was launching very few rockets, putting very few satellites into orbit. And if you fast forward to 2024, you see that they have almost gone a complete 180-degree turnaround. China was considered a very minor space player. Now they are considered the second leading space power behind the United States. This is an area that they have devoted a lot of attention and funding to. We see here, just in this chart here, in 2010, China for the first time equaled the United States in the number of launches. And then for the first time in 2011, they beat the U.S. And then you can see it sort of cycles back and forth. In the past few years, the U.S. has been leading the launch race, mainly due to SpaceX. But you can see that this is really quite an impressive achievement by China. During the 1990s, China had around a 75% launch success rate. Now they're at 96%. So they are up there with the world standards. And of course, if you're launching lots of rockets, you're probably also launching lots of satellites. And what we've seen is a rapid increase in the number of satellites that China is putting into orbit. Now, I like to include this slide because it also has comparison with the U.S. And it shows really that the U.S. is still, if you want to count numbers, is still the leading space power, right? Both in terms of quantity and quality. So it's not, we don't want to count the U.S. out just yet, right? But China is coming along very quickly. What we do see, though, when you compare China to itself is you do see the dramatic increase in the number of satellites that China now has in orbit. China has just about every type of satellite in orbit that a country could possibly want, right? They have electro-optical, which is, if you look on Google Maps, what you see. They have hyperspectral imaging, multispectral imaging, infrared. They have synthetic aperture radar that Bryan was talking about previously. They have a global satellite navigation system called Beidou. They have missile early warning satellites. They have electronic intelligence satellites. They have a space station. They have communication satellites. They've been up to the moon robotically. They have plans to send an astronaut up to the moon by 2030, trying to beat the United States. They've sent robotic missions to Mars. So across the spectrum, China is really excelling, or what we say in the US, hitting on all cylinders. They are really just moving out across all aspects of their space program. Also, if NIDS invites me back in 10 years, this graph could be much changed, because China is also looking at Starlink-like mega constellations. So right now, up to 4 different companies have plans to orbit up to 10,000 satellites by 2035. So you're looking at potentially China having 50,000 satellites up in orbit. Now, whether that will come true or not is a question, but those are plans. This is also not just a question about numbers. It's also a question about quality. And you see that just 2 years ago, the US Office of Director of National Intelligence declassified a report about China's space program, where they said that China would lead, or would be equal to the US in some space technologies by 2030. Okay? So not only are they putting a lot of things into orbit, their quality is also becoming comparable to the US. So, what is driving this? Just about every major article or book you see written in Chinese about space is the frame, "Whoever controls space will control the Earth." There's a sense here that in order to have victory here on Earth, you need to be able to control space. And so what we see in China's 2015 Defense White Paper is that they state that outer space has become a commanding height in the international strategic competition. And they place space in one of 4 critical security domains, along with maritime, cyber, and nuclear. So that's how important officially the Chinese government and ministry and military places space. Now, why do they say this? They have taken a look at the way that the US has fought wars since the 1991 Gulf War, and they see how space has played a major role in the way the US military fights and is successful. So the Chinese say that the US uses space-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, for 70 to 80% of its intelligence, and it uses satellites for 80% of its communications. So it's looking at what the US does and says, we want some of that. We want to be able to do exactly what the US military is doing. On the other hand, what they say is that space is a great strength for the US, but it's also a key vulnerability that if we take that out, we could severely degrade US military capabilities. So what they say is that without space, conducting modern war is not possible. And so what they see is that they see an evolution of war, where ground was before the strategic domain, then it moved to sea, and then to air, and that space in the future will be the strategic domain, that you have to be able to capture space or control space before you can win on the battlefield. And so the idea here then is to achieve space superiority, which they define as the ability to freely use space and deny space to adversaries. And so really what's driving this, and Bryan Clark probably spoke to this much better than I can, is really what China has realized is that the farther out that you want to project power, the more important space becomes. You can do reconnaissance through ships, through aircraft, over the horizon radar, but you really need space out there to be able to know what your enemy is doing. So if you want to be able to track, locate, and track your targets, you need space to do that. If you want to be able to have precision-guided munitions to guide those missiles or bombs in, you need a global satellite navigation system. If you wanted to do battle damage assessment to see how those strikes, whether those strikes were successful or not, you need space. And so that as China thinks about perhaps attacking bases in Japan, Guam, all the way down to Australia, space plays a major role in this. So both the US and Japan have to get used to the idea that we are going to be under constant surveillance. It's not going to be like, at least for the US, Iraq or Afghanistan. This is going to be an enemy that knows what we're up to at the strategic level. And of course, on the other side of this, China is also developing a lot of capabilities, a variety of capabilities to take out, to degrade, to destroy US space capabilities. I think this was most dramatically demonstrated in 2007 when China destroyed one of its aging weather satellites, created 3,000 bits of debris that are still up there. They've conducted a number of other tests, non-debris producing tests. In 2013, they conducted a test that went almost all the way up to geosynchronous orbit, raised a lot of eyebrows. They've been working on electronic warfare methods to disrupt space capabilities, capabilities to disrupt satellite communications, GPS. They're developing or have developed directed energy weapons. They have low-power lasers that can dazzle or blind the sensors on remote sensing satellites. According to the US Defense Department, sometime between 2025 and 2030, they will develop a higher-powered laser which can actually damage satellites, not just the sensor, but actually the satellite itself. China is investing in a number of co-orbital capabilities. So most prominent in 2021, the SJ-21 satellite grabbed a retired Beidou satellite navigation satellite and towed it up into a graveyard orbit. The implication here is that if you can grab a satellite, one of your own, maybe you can grab an adversary satellite. And of course, that test was against a cooperative target, not an uncooperative target like a US or Japanese satellite would be, but it is a capability nonetheless. And then finally, there are cyber attacks. China has been implicated in a number of cyber attacks against space-related functions, both in the United States and in Asia. They were implicated in attacks against the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, for example, against the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And so when you take all of these combined, right, what I like to say is that China is developing the capabilities to threaten space programs, whether it's the Japanese or the US space program, from the ground all the way up to geosynchronous orbit. Right? So all the way from the ground facilities on the Earth, all the way up to, let's say, our satellite communication, our communication satellites up in geo. So this presents a grave threat to the way that the US has fought wars. Finally, one thing that actually has me very concerned is China's development of what we call a fractional orbital bombardment system. Okay? So this is a system that they tested in July of 2021. They launched it. It went around the Earth. They released a hypersonic glide vehicle that then came in and struck a test site within China. This has me concerned for a variety of reasons. One is that FOBs, or fractional orbital bombardment systems, can better evade missile defenses. So let's say Japan's radars are all facing west towards China, right? So with a FOBs, they can direct that munition to come in behind our radars and to strike us where we're not looking. A FOBs can strike globally. So this is something that we have to not only worry about attacks in Japan, but also the continental US or anywhere in the world. And this is also both a conventional and nuclear capability if China decided to go down that route. My concern is that China is developing a quad. Now, what do I mean by that? The US has a nuclear triad made up of bombers, submarines, and missiles, right? China already has a nuclear triad. My concern here is that with this system, they could be developing a nuclear quad, which would maybe change the calculus on nuclear deterrence. Okay, so to wrap up, China has been making great advances across the spectrum in its space program. And in fact, if you want to take a look at it, the rise of China's space program actually mirrors the image of the rise of China itself, right? Both are coming along very, very quickly, presents some unique and some serious challenges to both the United States and Japan. And with that, I will happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
はい、ポール・ピーター先生、どうもありがとうございました。ポール・ピーター先生の方からはですね、拡大する中国の宇宙能力および対宇宙能力ということで、宇宙能力について言えば衛星の打ち上げの頻度が上がっているだけではなく、その成功率も上がっていて、かつ打ち上げられた衛星についてもその数もクオリティというものも上がっているというお話をいただきましたし、また対宇宙能力ですね、他社の宇宙利用を妨害する能力についてもですね、非常に他社の地上の宇宙システムの地上セグメントからさらには正式道場まであらゆるですね相手方の宇宙システムというものをですねターゲットにし得る能力というものを中国が持っているという話をいただきました。最後にですねアメリカは例えば核の3本柱というものがあるわけですけれども、ひょっとすると中国はこのFOBS部分軌道爆撃システムというものを加えることによって核の4本柱というものを目指しているのではないかというですね非常に興味深いご指摘というものもいただきました。それではですね3名の先生方からご発表をいただきましたので、続きまして討論に移りたいと思います。第1セッションのですね討論者は慶應義塾大学大学院法務研究科教授の青木節子先生にお願いしております。先生はですね防衛大学校の助教授、それから慶應義塾大学総合政策学部の准教授、そして同教授を経まして現職に就かれております。青木先生からはですね3名のご発表に対するコメント質問をいただきまして、続いてそれぞれの発表者の皆様から青木先生のコメント質問に対する回答ということをお願いできればというふうに思っております。それでは青木先生お願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。クラーク博士、クライン博士、ポール・ピーター博士の3人の報告者の方のご報告どうもありがとうございました。堅牢な先行研究の基盤の上に革新的創造的な議論を展開していただきまして非常に啓発されました。以下私のコメントを申し上げまた3人に同じご質問をいたしたいと思います。第1セッションのテーマ宇宙領域の戦略的環境の変化、同じテーマの下で3人の著名な研究者の方のご報告焦点を当てる部分が少しずつ異なりますが、やはり共通の結論というところもいくつかあったかと思います。第一にはやはり何といっても増大し続ける中国の脅威でありますし、第2には先進的で非伝統的なノンキネティックアプローチによる抑止体制の強化により実際の物理的な紛争を防止して回避すること、紛争を回避することという抑止の必要性です。最初の一撃が優位であるという宇宙を介した戦いにおいて相手が 攻撃に進むという意欲をなくさせる、これが重要であるとノンキネティックアプローチの防止機能が強調されています。第3には商業主体の持つ物流能力が国家安全保障に及ぼす決定的な影響であり、商業宇宙の利用が非対称的な優位を生み出すことができるという認識理解です。国家と商業主体が最適の混合性というか混合度で作り上げる非対称的優位性は、言葉を変えて言えばノンキネティックアプローチによる優位性とも言えると考えます。これは商業主体が伝統的なデータ情報提供者から能動的なノンキネティックアプローチにも乗り出すことを前提とした上での優位性の確保が想定されている。ここにこれ後でもう少ししたところで申し上げたいコメントでの課題というものも含まれていると思います。商業主体が能動的なノンキネティックアプローチに踏み出すということです。で第4に米国が主導して行うノンキネティックアプローチ、これ同盟国の協力というものが重要不可欠であるということと、第5に軍部と商業主体との信頼関係、効果的な任務分担というものが必要である。このような点はそれぞれ当てられている焦点は異なりましたけれども、共通の部分かというふうに考えました。で日本も同じようなアプローチに進んではいます。民間とすでに基調報告のところでペース先生からご報告いただきましたけれども、2023年6月13日の宇宙安全保障構想でも3本柱の一つとしてその宇宙産業と安全保障双方を強化することによる両循環の創設、これによって安全保障を高めていくというやり方が明記されています。でその中で現在実施されているもういくつかのプロジェクト進んでいますけれども、最も重要なものはやはり衛星コンステレーションの構築で、そこで官民の力の混合というものが出てくるかと思います。で日本も申し上げましたように他国と同様民間主体を安全保障目的に用いており、それをより包括的組織的に利用するという計画を持っていますけれども、少なくとも公式には、そして公式以外にも多分今はそうだと思いますが、民間宇宙能力をオフェンシブ攻撃的なノンキネティックアプローチとして使うことは考えられていないだろうと思います。民間企業の活動はディフェンシブなノンキネティックアプローチにとどまることになるというふうに想定されていると思います。ここで私今民間ですとか商業ですとか主体企業という言葉をあまり区別せずに使っていますが、それは今の議論では必要ないであろうというふうに考えてのことで、商業民間企業すべて同じ意味で使っております。で将来はただ商業主体民間主体もそのディフェンシブというところにとどまっていることは難しいだろうというふうに私は個人として考えますし、またディフェンシブであるのかオフェンシブであるのかということは相手方の取り方の問題でもあり、区別することは理論的にはかなり難しい問題でもあります。でそこで民間企業の持つ宇宙アセットというものは、それが政府の活動とともに協力するということになると、敵国からの脅威にさらされないわけにはいかないことになります。で近いところで私たちが教訓として学んでいるのはウクライナ戦争におけるスペース X 社のスターリンク衛星群の通信データです。これがウクライナの市民生活とウクライナ軍に活用されていたため、ロシアは国連総会を含む多くの公式の場でこの衛星群スターリンク衛星というような固有名詞は使ってはいたことは私の知る限りではない、名指しはしていませんでしたが、軍事目標にあたるで合法な攻撃の対象となると述べていました。でこの軍事目標の話についてここでは深入りはいたしません。でこの紛争時ということを少し離れて、 平時の軍事活動ということを考えますと、民間のアセット、宇宙アセットを使うときには、それが単に申し上げましたようにディフェンシブなものであっても、国家の軍事宇宙活動と一体化していると見られるときには、それが非友好的な活動となれば、相手側から、敵側から合法的な範囲での、いわゆる仕返し、もう少し専門用語的に言いますとリトルジョン、合法では、国際法上合法ではあるけれども非友好的な活動に対する、やはり国際法上合法ではあるけれども非友好的な仕返し、報復というものを受けることになりますし、これが違法な干渉、インターベンションとまで認識されたときには、違法なインターベンションであれば国際法上の違法行為にあたりますので、均衡性を持つ対抗措置の対象となるということになります。何が違法な干渉を構成するかということは必ずしも明らかではありませんが、民間宇宙アセットの行う活動が強制的な要素を持って敵国の本来予定していた活動というものを歪めるとき、阻害するときには、敵側はそれを違法な干渉と判断する余地が十分にあり、民間宇宙アセットは敵方が被った被害と均衡する損害、これを受けることを勘定しなければならないというふうに、一応国際法上ではなっていると思います。どういう活動が例えばそういうものになるのかって、これはケースを挙げていくことは難しいとは思いますが、例えば一時的に敵側の相手側の衛星の制御、テレメトリートラッキング&コマンドを奪って衛星の機能を低下させたり、軌道が少し維持できなくなったり損傷を加えたような場合には、それが民間のアセットが行ったものであったとしても、対抗措置としての非例性を持つスプーフィング、その他の行為を受け軌道が維持できなくなったり、あるいは機能が完全に破壊されてしまったりということもあろうかと思います。そこで民間を国がどう守っていくのかということが必要になろうかと思います。どのような取り決めを事前に行い、どのように保護すべきなのか。民間衛星が汎用利用されていて、さまざまな顧客に対してデータや情報を送っている、一国内外の商用目的で使われているときには、特にそのような場合がほとんどでしょうから、国と民間主体の間では十分な事前の保障の取り決めなどがなされなければいけないでしょうし、また平時からだんだんに紛争状況になってくることを考えますと、新たな政府保障なのか保険なのか姿は見えませんが、枠組みというものがないとサステナブルな形での国と企業の協力は困難なものとなるだろうというふうに考えました。特に日本では宇宙の安全保障利用が法的に可能となったのは2008年の宇宙基本法が制定されてからのことであり、国と民間の宇宙安全保障協力の歴史は浅いものがあります。より効果的にアメリカとともに脅威に立ち向かう、アメリカや他の友好国とともに立ち向かうためにも、日本国内で国と企業の間のリスク分担というものを具体的に詳細に事前に定めておくことが必要だろうと思われます。これが今3人のご報告の中に出てきました官民のトラストビルディングであったり、コンフィデンスビルディング、信頼関係が必要だということの一部にもなるだろうと思います。また他の軍事分野の国と民間の協力にも増して、宇宙には国際法上は面倒な問題があると思います。これは宇宙条約の第6条の観点ですが、第6条では国が行う活動と私人ノンガバメンタルエンティティーズ、民間主体商業主体が行う活動というものを区別せず、すべての宇宙活動ナショナルアクティビティーズ・イン・アウター・スペースと規定されていますが、これに対して国が直接に国際的責任を有するという制度を持っています。そうなりますと民間と 国の区分というものが一層難しい世界を宇宙の法体系の中ではそういうものが組み込まれていると言えると思います。また宇宙活動について自衛権の行使以降の世界、武力紛争法が規定する世界は不明瞭ではありますが、武力行使未満の先ほど申し上げました不干渉義務違反であったり非友好的な行為についての、リトルジョンについてルールが非常に不明瞭なです。でこれは明確になるということは事柄の性質上はありません。多分非常にも難しいでしょうけれども、少なくとも同盟国の間では緊張が高まる事態をエスカレートさせないためにも、そのようなどういうルール規範があるのか、作るのか決めるのか、基準について議論を重ね信頼を高めることが必要であろうと思いました。以上の部分がコメントで、これから3人の報告者の方に同じ質問をいたしたいと思います。2問お伺いいたしますが、そのうちの1問にお答えくださっても2問ともお答えくださっても結構です。で最初の質問は今申し上げていたことに関係します。アメリカや日本、その他の同盟国とともに民間の宇宙能力を活用して非対称的なアプローチを取り、中国の作戦能力を低下させるというときには、民間企業の宇宙アセットが軍事目標と判断される局面があるでしょう。またそこまで明確にならないときでも国と一体化して違法な干渉行為を行ったとされて対抗措置、あるいは報復リトルジョンを受ける場合もあるでしょう。でどのような方策で民間企業を守ることができるのだろうかということです。でその時にその際、アメリカ、日本、その他の国がそれぞれ自国民の企業について行うべきことは何か、また場合によってはその国境を越えて外国企業との間で行うべきことがさまざまあろうかと思いますが、同盟国、友好国同士でよりよく協力するためにはどのような準備をしておくことが今最も重要であると考えるか、この点をお伺いしたいと思います。これが第1点です。そして質問の2番目は、中国への情報優位を維持構築するための同盟国間の結束において日本が果たす役割についてです。日本が持つ優位性と日本が今後急いで備えることが望ましい点についてお考えをお伺いしたいと思います。例えば宇宙領域把握 SDA においては日本は地理的な有用性を持っているというようなことがあるかもしれませんし、そういうものでもないのかもしれません。そのような点について忌憚のない見解をお伺いできましたらと思います。
はい、青木先生、コメントとご質問ありがとうございました。それでは残りですね、第1セッションは50分までということですので、各発表者の皆様からは4分ずつ回答いただければと思います。順番としてはですね、最初の発表とは逆にということで、まずはですね、ポール・ピーター先生から回答をいただいて、次にですね、クライン先生にお答えいただき、最後にクラーク先生にお答えいただければというふうに思います。それではポール・ピーター先生からよろしくお願いいたします。
Okay, so I'm neither a commercial space expert or a Japan expert, but now I am. But let me offer some thoughts. I think one way that Japan can that the U.S. and Japan can sort of more tightly work together is through increased space situational awareness. I think there's a way there that maybe doesn't cross the weaponization threshold, which will allow Japan to provide some valuable capabilities. I'm just thinking out of the box, but potentially additional launch capabilities that if for some reason U.S. launch capabilities are restricted, Japan would offer another venue for launching. I think just overall, Japan's satellite navigation system, as well as its remote sensing systems, can provide some redundancy to the U.S., especially if China begins to degrade those assets. Thank you.
So I'm going to actually try to take on both questions, and I have 4 minutes. Okay. And I see a question in the chat. I'll try to roll that up. So in the chat, it talks about, is there a downside, or are there any repercussions if the U.S. tries to maintain an asymmetric advantage using commercial? I would point out we already have it. We've had an asymmetric with commercial, as the charts show as I throw my mic, but we've have it. And so what is the implications to that? And I want to go back to Clausewitzian thinking, competition, crisis, and conflict. It's a political choice. It's the aims of policy. So technology in itself doesn't cause conflict. Sometimes we talk about the security dilemma and the role of technologies, but I would say that goes against Clausewitzian thinking and the primacy of politics and political aims. But to your point, how should we prepare for what we see, the claims that Putin has leveled against the United States of using Starlink, commercial companies and capabilities in a military way, as a military object. So we have to address those full on. I think a lot of talking to folks in SpaceX, I think they were caught off guard with the ethical questions of being associated with being part of the kill chain. Maybe that's why they came up with the follow-on to Starlink, Starshield, which would be a divested part to focus on defense. What I find, I understand that U.S. rivals are going to target U.S. capabilities in times of conflict. I think that should be a given and is not original insight. What I'm trying to bring up within the folks in the D.C. area is the U.S. and its allies going to go after commercial capabilities or quasi-commercial capabilities, third-party entities in times of conflict? And whenever I ask that question, depending on who I ask, half the time the answer is, of course we are, Patsy. We're going to do whatever it takes to win. And then the lawyers in the room and the policy people suck their teeth and say, well, we say we do different. We say we distinguish between the military object and the non-military object, the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. I just want to point out, the U.S. and the West, we have a different approach to the legal regime. I'm not a lawyer. I usually travel with my counsel wherever I go to keep out of trouble. Just kidding on that one. But there's a difference between rule of law, in the West. The purpose of the law is to prevent rights of citizens, privacy, than rule by law, which is more commensurate with the Chinese approach. So the legal regime serves the aims of the Chinese Communist Party. That's a fundamentally different approach. So when Russia and China use lawfare, the intentional distortion of legal regimes, we have to be prepared to go after that. But I think the U.S. needs to talk to its allies about what's their comfort level going after third-party entities. We'll say if another space power is providing services to China in times of conflict, are they a legitimate military target? Talking to the lawyers and the policy people, it's less of a legal question. It'll be more of a policy question, because do we want to set a norm, a normative behavior that is counterproductive to how the United States does business? Strong points for Japan, definitely geography. I would say the industrial-based technology sector. In DC, the company Astroscale, is a wonderful company with capabilities. I'm a big fan of space sustainability and active debris removal. Weak points, and I'm not an expert in Japanese law, but getting past, the legacy of the Constitution and self-defense, and what's the role of Japan protecting itself, I think is an ongoing question. Thank you.
はい、クラーク先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Yeah, so to build on what Kevin and Patsy talked about, in terms of commercial capabilities, the U.S. military, as Patsy was saying, is using commercial systems to support mostly our kind of administrative operations. So when you're deployed and you're using commercial satellite communications, that's generally not for something in the kill chain. That's for administrative traffic. It's for organizational discussions. It's about making the ship and the crew and the forces ready to fight and planning, but not necessarily sending targeting information to allow a missile to engage an enemy force. So usually when you transition to something being in the kill chain, we end up making that a government-owned entity, which is why they have the distinction with Starshield versus Starlink in the U.S. military, whereas you see Ukraine using Starlink for both the kill chain and its planning traffic. So I think what we would see is in the U.S. case, we're going to continue to try to make things that are part of the kill chain that provide target information, make those government owned. And then you have this area of commercial services that are quasi-governmental because they're essentially providing full-time service to the U.S. or the allies that's used not necessarily for conducting engagements, but is used to conduct the planning that supports the future engagements. And so there's a question as to, is that a legitimate target? Can you attack the planning functions of your opponent? Probably. But then, it depends on how you interpret that administrative activity and whether it's a legitimate target if it's hosted on a commercial system. And I think the U.S., as Patsy said, we still haven't sorted that out. Arguably, the Chinese may not make that distinction. And I think as Kevin talked about, though, it's unlikely the Chinese would mount destructive attacks against those commercial satellites to defeat our planning functions and the traffic that's on there. So it may be non-kinetic attacks that degrade those commercial systems, which may be recoverable. And in which case, maybe that the damage is not that much to worry about. But I do think it's an open question as to whether U.S. and allies will attack commercial systems that are hosting adversary planning activities. In general, though, most of the commercial systems still don't have the latency or the quality of data to support targeting, meaning allowing me to use that commercial satellite to steer a weapon onto a target. Usually they provide me enough information to then use some other platform to get that target information. So it keeps the commercial systems out of the kill chain, which I think is an important distinction to bring up. One other thing is on the non-kinetic effects side, there's a lot of interest in using commercially derived capabilities to support warfighting. So you see that on the kinetic side with companies like Anduril and others. The U.S. does want to try to bring some of that commercially derived capability into the government to support non-kinetic effects. So cyber tools, electronic warfare effects. Some of those might be on orbit in space, in which case the government would then buy those from the commercial provider and the government would then own it. But there could be on-orbit non-kinetic activities that are coming out of the commercial world, bought by the government and then used by the government to attack enemy space systems. And then in terms of Japan's advantages, what we found in the wargaming that we've been doing over the last year with the Japanese Self-Defense Force is proximity to China in a lot of cases ends up being an advantage because you can use smaller, less expensive, more attritable, shorter range or faster short range or slow and long range uncrewed systems. So uncrewed systems can be a much more diverse array of them can be employed by the Japanese Self-Defense Force. And because of Japan's proximity, it's very defensive. The operations end up being defensive rather than being offensive. When the U.S. comes over to this region and operates, we can be perceived as being an aggressor because we're projecting power into the Western Pacific, whereas Japan is acting defensively to protect its own territory and waters. So those ended up being significant advantages in these war games in terms of the forces that could be relevant. Whereas for the US, the forces generally have to be much longer range, more capable, more expensive to be able to make that transit into the theater. So those are a couple of things that we have found in our work with the JSDF that are significant advantages. With that, I'll turn it back over to Yazoo, and thank you very much.
はい、ありがとうございました。これでですね、第1セッションを終わりたいと思いますので、最後にですね、素晴らしいご発表と議論を行っていただきました、クラーク先生、クライン先生、ポール・ピーター先生、そして青木先生に大きな拍手をお願いいたします。第1セッションでいくつかご質問をいただいておりますけれども、この中のものについてはですね、第3セッションの方で時間の許す限りお答えをしたいというふうに考えておりますので、どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。次のですね、第2セッションの方は13時半から開始しますので、皆様それまでにお戻りいただければというふうに考えております。以上です。ありがとうございました。